On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster changed the lives of millions living near the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the scientists who responded to the crisis. These are some of their stories, intimate portraits of research, innovation, discovery. Welcome, I'm Jim McNamee, editor of Dispatches from the Gulf, a series of documentaries, short videos, and podcasts. This week, we're looking at the state of the Gulf 7 years after the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill. Since 2010, hundreds of scientists have been researching the effects of this spill, and here's some of what they've found so far. First up is Dean Grubbs, a professor at Florida State University who studies the animals living at the bottom of the ocean, including sharks.
I'm cautiously optimistic that the effects of the spill were relatively short-lived and moderate. Most of the animals that live in this region are somewhat pre-adapted to oil anyway because there are natural seeps and things, but they're certainly not pre-adapted to deal with a blowout anywhere near the magnitude of the Deepwater Horizon spill. Any kind of physiological effects of the oil seem to have been relatively short-lived. Those seem to have dissipated after a couple of years. The toxins associated with the oil, we saw that those peaked about a year and a half after the spill and have subsided since then. So I'm cautiously optimistic that the overall physiological population effects for the larger mobile animals like the fish that we study, the sharks that we study, were pretty moderate. I think where the effects were most acute, of course, are where you would expect them to be acute. Coastal marshes, coastal oyster beds and oyster reefs, deepwater corals, for example, things that can't get up and run, can't get up and swim away, that have to stay there and take it. It's likely that those deep water communities may take decades or even centuries to recover.
While Dean Grubbs is optimistic, John Hildbrandt, a professor at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, thinks that continued research is critical.
The thing about the spill is there are effects that happen on the short term, immediate effects, and there are effects that happen in the long term. And from everything we know about marine mammal response to oil spills, it takes many years, maybe decades, to see the full impact of the spill. I think we need to be there a few more years. You need to take a long-term perspective and collect a long time series. In the Exxon Valdez case, there was a very well documented, there are two populations of killer whales that are in the area of the spill. And the best study we have in terms of response to the spill come from the studies of those two kinds of killer whales. And what we see at this point, and it's been a long time, more than 20 years since that spill, is that the fish-eating killer whales were impacted at the time of the spill. Their population decreased by 50% or more, but they've been on a slow path to recovery. The mammal-eating killer whales from the Exxon Valdez look like they're on a path to extinction. Their numbers have been steadily dropping since the spill. So it just gave me this perspective that we need to stay in the Gulf of Mexico and keep monitoring for decades, really, to get the sense of the impact of the spill.
One of the populations of native species that will need to be monitored are oysters in the Gulf. Sean Powers, a professor and chair at the Department of Marine Sciences at the University of South Alabama, explains.
In 2010, something very bad happened to oyster populations in the central Gulf of Mexico, in particular in Louisiana and the Mississippi-Alabama region. We've never seen oysters take this long to recover from a disturbance. Hurricane Katrina was a huge disturbance to oyster reefs. It buried some oyster reefs, it dislodged them, it affected a lot of the habitats that oysters need to survive. But even after that scale of disturbance, we saw a recovery in 2 or 3 years. We haven't seen recovery from the Deepwater Horizon, at least after 6 years of the spill. But we're still hopeful that oysters will bounce back.
Ed Overton, a professor emeritus at Louisiana State University, is hopeful for the future.
When you talk about the worst thing in the world, there's things like nuclear explosions, things like that will contaminate an area, and it will be contaminated for years and decades. The good news about an oil spill is that oil is a natural product. It comes out of the ground, and it has not been modified by humans. So it is a degradable form of carbon. All oil initially started as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Through photosynthesis, it was turned into biomass. That biomass died, settled on the bottom of the ocean, was cooked further into oil and natural gas. And in a big oil spill, basically you bring it out of the ground and the natural bacteria start degrading that oil. Degradation of that oil means that the bacteria are eating it as food, and they're turning it into more bacteria. And of course, that living process also produces carbon dioxide. So ultimately, you started as carbon dioxide, and oil turns back into carbon dioxide, right? And what we want to do with an oil spill is to speed that process. We don't want it to linger around. We want to keep the oil in an aerobic environment where there's plenty of oxygen, where the bacteria can do their job. The oil will go away, and when the oil goes away, the environment starts recovering. And that's what we're seeing in coastal Louisiana and all along the northern Gulf of Mexico right now.
Finally, Tracy Sutton, an associate professor at Nova Southeastern University, explains why we must keep doing research in advance of any future spills.
Humans are fairly clever, and we figure out how to solve problems. So historically, one of the biggest problems with extracting resources from the deep ocean has just been the logistics of doing that. We figured out how to do that. There's really no ocean depth that we can't plumb for resources. One of the problems associated with that is we don't have an inventory of what lives, and the deeper you go, the less information we have. So we're venturing into systems where we don't really have a complete inventory. Because of the research since Deepwater Horizon, we know the deep Gulf of Mexico, particularly this midnight zone below 3,000 feet. We probably know it better than anywhere else in the world. What this will allow us is, if something happens again, we won't really be going in blind like we did right after the oil spill, where we had to do an assessment of the damage in the Gulf of Mexico without any prior data whatsoever. So what we have now, we wouldn't call it baseline data because it's all after the oil spill, but we at least have comparative data such that we can look at changes over long periods of time, figure out what is the natural variability of the system. That way, if there is another such event, and we certainly hope there's not, but if there is, we'll be better equipped to handle what are the things we need to look at immediately, and at what time scales do we need to respond to things.
Today, thousands of scientists, oceanographers, chemists, engineers, biologists are all working together to develop newer and better ways to understand and ease the impact of oil spills. To learn more about their work, visit our webpage at dispatchesfromthegulf.com. Funding for this podcast was provided by a grant by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. And thanks for listening.